interested in conflict resolution. It's one of our topics. There are various things you can do in schools towards retributive presentations whereby bullies and difficult situations in the school playground can be mediated by properly trained teachers. There are even things that are sometimes used in prisons and various other institutions. But overall, there's a general sense amongst humanists that the problems of the world could well do with a little bit of sensible negotiation between people of opposing views. So even in the case of, well, I'm thinking of conflict, but even when there isn't much conflict, just some sort of different interests, then you have the possibility of entering into negotiation. Now, I'd like to talk about a book here which was first published in 1981 and has never been out of print since. It's written by people from the Harvard Negotiation Project, which has been going for many decades. And they put forward an idea, getting to yes, which I think is something that virtually everybody here could benefit from considering, because the book's not very long, and it's worth looking at. Subtitle is Negotiating an Agreement Without Giving In. I'd just like to run through some of the points, if I may, without any fancy slides to assist me. So I'll start off, and largely it's common sense, just articulated by repeated debates and seminars and so on in an academic environment, followed by road testing it in actual mediation sessions, ranging from domestic disputes in a suburban setting to the conflict between territories in Kashmir or the Middle East. But the most important point that they start with is something which everybody should remember, I think, and that is don't bargain over your position. What happens when people have some degree of conflict, or let's say negotiation where you're negotiating just the price of something that you want to buy? That's something without too much conflict. But you tend to say, I've got a position, I'm going to not pay more than $19 for this, whatever it is, and I'm going to bargain with this guy who wants $70. And these people say that arguing over your position, focusing on your position and arguing over that is the wrong way to go. It has various things wrong with it. They start off by saying that any method of negotiation may be fairly judged by three criteria. It should produce a wise agreement, if agreement is possible at all. It should be efficient, and it should improve or not damage the relationship between the parties at the beginning. A wise agreement can be defined as one which meets the legitimate interests of each side to the extent possible, resolves conflicting interests fairly, is durable, and takes community interests into account as well. Now, when they talk about positional arguments, they say that there are various things that can be said against it. Your ego becomes identified with your own position often enough, and you start to say, oh, I'm damned if I'm going to let this guy get away with it, in some sense. And you're keen on saving face too, because if you start off with some position and then you're forced to realise that that's not very realistic and you want to backtrack, then you've lost a bit of face and you're reluctant to do so. And then if you pay attention to your positions over everything else, less attention is devoted to meeting the underlying concerns of the parties. And we'll come to that a bit later. You try in positional bargaining to improve your chance of any settlement that's favourable to you, and you start off with, say, an ambit claim, an extreme position. You stubbornly hold on to it as long as you can, and you want to deceive the other party that you really would be happy with only half that, or something like this. And also, the positional bargaining becomes a contest of will, where the two sides want to simply be obstinate or overrule the other side. And so those are the various reasons where there are drawbacks to positional bargaining. And it's even worse if you've got more than two people involved. When you come to the United Nations with over 150 countries negotiating to do some action, it is virtually impossible to find a common position, even amongst the South group or the West group or this group or that group. But even they can't come to a common position to argue against the others. And so it becomes ridiculous. So they've decided on an alternative to positional arguing. That's the basic exposition of this book. They call it, let's see, principled negotiation, or negotiating on merits. And here they say there are 4 points that the method is constructed by. Think of peoples, interests, options and criteria. With peoples, you have to separate the people involved from the problem. With interests, you focus not on people's positions, but on their real interests, as far as they can be teased out and understood. Options, you think laterally and generate a whole lot of possibilities before you ever decide what you're going to do. And criteria, you insist with the other parties that the result ought to be based on some objective standard. Say fairness is a typical one to use. So that you say, well, I might think it's fair, you might think it's unfair. So I wonder what's the market price for this? What's the general opinion that we can appeal to? Is there an expert opinion from an international climate change group or what have you? So now I'd like to go to this page, which I can't show you, which has 3 columns. Problem, soft treatment of positional views, hard treatment of positional views, or change the game and negotiate on the merits. This is their recommendation. So they say that you can be a positional arguer, but be pretty soft and always looking for some sort of compromise and flattering the other side and saying, yes, you've made a very good point there and all that stuff. But if you happen to have the opposite type of guy, the hard bargainer who is completely cut and dried and down the, then he will always win over you. There's no way you can win an argument or get a negotiation between soft and hard that satisfies anybody but the hard guy. So I'll just mention some of the points that they make. The soft guy says the participants in the negotiation are all friends. The hard guy says or regards them as adversaries. The principled people say they are participants. The participants are problem solvers together. In the soft case, the goal is agreement. The hard man says the goal is victory. The yes man says the goal is a wise outcome reached efficiently and amicably. The soft guy says we'll have to make concessions to cultivate our relationship. The hard one says we demand concessions as a condition of our relationship. And the new approach is to separate the people from the problem entirely. Just don't bring that into it. So the soft guy tends to be soft on the people and soft on the problem. The hard guy is hard on the problem and the people, whereas the recommended approach is to be soft on the people but hard on the problem. You separate them to that extent. The soft guy says we have to trust each other. The hard guy says, at least to himself, I distrust the other side completely. These people say proceed independent of trust and say so. So if you're challenged, don't you trust me? You say, look, this is not a question of trust. This is a practical question of whether this house gets built according to the time schedule required or whatever it might be. The soft person tends to change his position easily. The hard one digs into his position. And then the game-changing way is to focus on interests, not positions, which I'll come to a bit later. The soft guy makes offers, the hard guy makes threats, and the new method is explore interests. The soft person will be searching for a single answer, the one that the other side will accept. The hard guy is also looking for a single answer, but the one that he will accept. The game-changing version is to develop multiple options to choose from and then decide later. And finally, just dropping down to the last line, the soft person tends to yield to pressure when pressure is applied, like threats or, looking, you don't do this by tomorrow, it's going to collapse or whatever. And the hard guy is the one who applies the pressure, but in the game-changing scheme, reason and be open to reasons and yield to principle only, not pressure. Now, on the subject of interests, let's see. I'd like to illustrate it by reading out some examples of how interests can be understood to be different from the initial positions that were taken. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which was blocked out at Camp David in 1978, demonstrates the usefulness of looking behind positions. Israel had occupied the Sinai Peninsula since the Six-Day War of 1967. When Egypt and Israel sat down together in 1978 to negotiate peace, their positions were incompatible. Israel insisted on keeping some of the Sinai. Egypt, on the other hand, insisted that every inch of the Sinai be returned to Egyptian sovereignty. Time and again, people drew maps showing possible boundary lines that might divide the Sinai between Egypt and Israel. Compromising in this way was wholly unacceptable to Egypt. To go back to the situation as it was in 1967 was unacceptable to Israel. Looking at their interests instead of their positions made it possible to develop a solution. Israel's interest lay in security, security. And they didn't watch Egyptian tanks poised on their border ready to roll across at any time. Whereas Egypt's interests lay in sovereignty. The Sinai had been part of Egypt since the time of the pharaohs, and after centuries of domination by Greeks, Romans, Turks, French and British, Egypt had only recently regained full sovereignty and was not about to cede territory to another foreign conqueror. At Camp David, President Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin of Israel agreed to a plan that would return the Sinai to complete Egyptian sovereignty and, demilitarizing large areas, would still assure Israeli security. The Egyptian flag would fly everywhere, but the Egyptian tanks would be nowhere near Israel. So that's just one example. And I think, got another one, I think. Another one in a business situation, which is quite amusing. A businessman was frustrated in his efforts to buy a radio station, and he came along to a negotiation consultant. The majority owner was willing to sell his 2/3 of the station for a reasonable figure, but the 1/3 owner was demanding what seemed an exorbitant price. The businessman had raised his offer several times to no avail and was beginning to consider abandoning the whole thing. The negotiation consultant asked why the second owner was asking such a high price. The businessman didn't know. He assumed the seller would be retiring. But does the seller want to retire? What does she do now? Well, it turned out that the second owner was the young and highly successful manager of the radio station. Suddenly realizing that the second owner had less interest in money than in managing a radio station, of which he was a part owner, the businessman offered to buy only a portion of the owner's interest that he needed for tax reasons, and to keep her on, guarantee to keep her on as manager. The second owner accepted the offer at a price that saved the businessman $1 million. Understanding the seller's underlying interests had greatly enhanced the buyer's negotiating powers. Now, there are some chapters that talk about, when things don't work quite so well as the overall drift of negotiation might hope. If you get opponents who are far more powerful than you, it can be difficult. So they've suggested another concept which I find a little bit harder to understand myself, but they call it the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So when you go into an agreement, it's a good idea to say to yourself, what if we just don't get anywhere with this? What am I going to do? What will we do about this problem? And if you think out in advance some alternatives and then select the best one that you'd like to do, move to Sydney and start again or something or other, then you get much stronger in your negotiation. You feel more confident. How do they say it? We should use it as a standard against which any proposed agreement can be measured. To say, is this any better than what I can do by myself, if you like, without this agreement? So that's the strategy of best alternative to negotiated agreement. And the two main advantages, they say, is that it gives you protection against making a bad agreement during the course of negotiations, or against accepting something that you shouldn't do, or something less than you could have done. And also it says that you can use your assets to advantage. I'm not quite sure what that means. Let's see. Because, that's this, yeah, I said that. The advantage idea. The better your alternative, the greater your ability to improve the terms of any negotiated agreement. Knowing what you're going to do if the negotiation does not lead to agreement gives you confidence in the negotiating process itself. It's easier to break off negotiations if you know where you're going. And the greater your willingness to break off negotiations, the more forcefully you can present your interests. Now, what else? A couple of other illustrations, again from the Middle East. Here we go. This is if you find that the negotiations going nowhere and there seem to be too entrenched on the other side, you can try something like, well, if you really want that, wouldn't that have an interesting effect and lead them to think about the consequences of their position or their argument? And this is an example. In 1970, an American lawyer interviewed President Nasser of Egypt on the subject of the Arab-Israeli conflict. He asked Nasser, what is it that you really want Golda Meir to do? Nasser replied, withdraw. Withdraw? The lawyer asked. Withdraw from every inch of Arab territory. Without a deal? Nothing from you? The American asked incredulously. Nothing. It's our territory. She should promise to withdraw, Nasser replied. The American asked, what would happen to Golda Meir if tomorrow morning she went on Israeli radio and television and said, on behalf of the people of Israel, I hereby promise to withdraw from every inch of territory occupied in '67. The Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. And I want you to know, I have no commitment of any kind from any Arab. Nasser burst out laughing. Oh, would she have trouble at home? Understanding what an unrealistic option Egypt had been offering may have contributed to Nasser's stated willingness later that same day to accept the ceasefire in the war of attrition. And the other clue they give to somewhat recalcitrant confrontations is when the two sides are wandering around with their own sort of ideas as to what they would like to happen, and there's a mediator, a negotiator, who can't sort of get much traction. So they say that the negotiator should devise a plan of action themselves, so that then everybody can argue about that single one. And the most famous use of the one text procedure was again at Camp David in September 1978, when mediating between Egypt and Israel. The United States listened to both sides, prepared a draft to which no one was committed, and asked for criticism. They improved the draft again and again until the mediators felt they could improve it no longer. After 13 days and 23 drafts, the US had a text that it was prepared to recommend. When President Carter did recommend it, Israel and Egypt accepted it. So it prevented the two parties from getting increasingly locked into their prejudiced positions, you see, if they were able to look at something else that at least appeared to have elements of both sides talking about things. That's about all I've got, I think, from this book. And let's see, it can't be compared with the wonderful presentation we've just had from Tim, which showed the use of the rational human faculty to improve clear thinking. But I think this also could be seen as a kind of a rational approach to improving the understanding that people have to have when they get into a negotiation. There are rational points, there are points of fact, of course, there are these sorts of things. But there's also a great deal of sensitivity required to understanding where these people, other people, come from, and where you yourself come from. And if you can think ahead to what's going to happen next week, not worry about what happened in 1432 or whatever, you'll be able to encourage the other side to come together. And so this is the kind of almost interfaith dialogue which humanists are interested in considering when it comes to difficulties with immigrants in Australia or at whatever level you like. So any questions on that? Interest?
Stephen, just a comment.
Yeah.
That it's, I know that a lot of this work has contributed to the whole field of alternative dispute resolution and the training of mediators. And I can sort of see a lot of the conceptual work that this group has done has fed into the training, the professional training of mediators. Now, I had experience about 18 months ago of a sort of professional mediation in a dispute that we were in, and despite the fact that we were utilising the president of the Institute of Arbitrators and Mediators, it went round in circles for 8 hours because one side just really emotionally was not prepared to negotiate in good faith. So I don't know whether the skill of the mediator in that case was insufficient or whether the parties involved were so bloody minded that it was just not going to happen one way or the other.
Yes, yes, it must be a common experience. There are many examples given in the book of surprising suggestions made by the mediator. Go and have lunch or together, or all sorts of apparently irrelevant things, which break the cycle and surprise. If you can give something that surprises them, that they're not expected to hear, then you can often break through. Of course, the simplest thing to do is say, what you say is very true. I've been worrying about that point myself. But from our point of view, it looks like slightly different, and so on. There are lots of tricks I think you can... And they make the point that you should get into, this is written for potential mediators, you should get into the game first and start with little disputes, and gradually you will develop your talents in that area.
Tim?
How much different is this from what this Stephen Covey fellow says? First listen, then be heard, and a win-win or no deal.
Yes. Certainly listening and being heard is a very important part of this. I'm not sure that I can answer too much comparatively.
Well, could I say that's the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and it's first
Yes,
seek to understand. First, seek to understand before being understood.
And then seek to understand, then
It's one of the 7
I
habits.
see, I haven't read that, I'm sorry. Yeah.
That sounded,
No.
it's about personal development and concerning, you, how you can
Yes.
improve self.
Uh,
That's Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but what seems to be discussed here is how to get agents that could be irrational to agree on different bases and try to sort out, I guess, distinguish the differences between the personal disagreements with the objects of the disagreement. Yes.
Some form of argument mapping would be very helpful, because it would enable you to understand, supposing the other side gave you their arguments, or put a case in front of you to begin with. If you analysed that properly, then you would know where to go from there. So I think that is a clear point where argument mapping would touch, I think, the whole game. But I'm sure you're right. In a way, it's all common sense, but it's useful to have a few checklists of things way to look at it. And I think this business of avoiding positions and separating the substance from the people, the substance of the dispute from the people that happen to be representing that case, are very important things that not everybody would remember in the heat of a debate.
Tim?
I think it's an absolutely terrific book, and in fact, on occasion in the past when I've had what for me at least was a big negotiation coming up, the night before I've taken out the book and I've read the book just to refresh on all those principles, and on occasion it's really worked really well. But on other occasions it hasn't worked because, in my perception of the situation, the other party just didn't want to play the game. They didn't want to play by those principles or those rules. They had their approach, and they didn't want to listen to any way of structuring negotiation that might focus on interests rather than positions and so forth. But even so, it's helpful, I think, for oneself. Even if when you get into the negotiation, you're not going to have a well-structured getting to yes type of interplay. Nevertheless, it's useful to remind yourself, well, what are my interests here? Really?
Yeah.
And what is my BATNA? And just those basic points that can try to draw you away from the emotional involvement in your position.
Yes, exactly.
And also your inevitable sense of tension or even hostility to the other party. Try to draw yourself away from
their shoes.
and yes, I think that this is, related to that previous question. The principles are useful for oneself, even if they don't come into play when you're actually in a negotiating situation.
But don't you think that in the case, the bad case you cited, if you had expressed clearly that you sympathised and understood with the other side's position, or the other side's argument and apparent interest, wouldn't that be an encouragement to them to say, yes, he respects us, this is worth persisting with? Maybe you didn't do that sufficiently.
No, look, I think elements of it could be useful, could be productive, that for sure. But sometimes, you don't even really have time to sometimes the negotiation is just, it's really a kind of, the other side is taking a bulldozer approach, and you just don't get much opportunity to try those things.
I will
Just for reference, I don't know if it was mentioned during the talk, BATNA, that's the acronym for Best Alternative to
It is
Negotiated
Yes.
Agreement.
Yes. Yes.
It seems like an interesting collection of ideas that people have accumulated about negotiation, but I have to tell you that what I take away is that solutions looking for a problem.
Well, problems arise spontaneously and perennially between people.
I repeat though what I said.
This is a solution looking for a problem.
Yes, solutions.
We don't think there's a real problem about people negotiating in good faith?
I'm not doubting that, but I'm
So there's
just
the problem.
saying that again, I repeat what I said. But it seems like, I'm not disputing that these are good solutions,
Yes.
but what I'm saying is that they're solutions for a problem which really hasn't been understood.
Well,
And what I'm
But-
saying, I'll repeat what I said,
Yeah.
which was, do you or do you not agree that there are negotiations that need better ways to get to a solution?
You're saying that's what the problem is.
No, I'm asking you a question.
I don't know. So the point is, if I could...
We're focusing on the person, the people in
I'm
the
suggesting
disagreement here. What's the object of the disagreement?
I regret if I haven't been gone into enough detail to show you the kind of disputes and difficulties that arise in the many examples that are given here. And so therefore what comes across tonight is a very, very generalised sort of summary.
Yeah, I didn't have that impression at all. I thought they were quite, I thought they were good advice and quite, distinct solutions for different sorts of negotiating situations. But to me, that's the impression I had. Is that in lots of things in life, you'll come across that. Could be an accumulation of suggestions on how to do something. But if you stand back, what you'll realise is that we don't really understand the problem that we're making suggestions, or that we've found solutions to. I mean, we may well have they might be perfectly good solutions, but it doesn't mean that we actually understand the general problem, if you like.
Well, maybe not, but I think the aim of the operation then in civic is getting to an agreement, not necessarily whether it's the ideal agreement or the most profound agreement that would be possible in history. Yes.
I enjoyed your presentation. The point to me of principled negotiation is that it gets better results than negotiation from position. And I always remember it by the example of the orange. I'm not sure if that's in that book.
I don't think so, no.
Okay, so it's two sisters who both want an orange. They love each other and they care for each other, so they compromise and they take half an orange each. And one squeezes the orange and has an orange juice, and the other one uses the rind to make a cake. They could have had everything they wanted by just one taking the rind and one taking the orange. If they just discussed the principles of, actually I'm going to make a cake, I just need the rind. All right, you can have all that.
Yes.
I sometimes go into meetings with an orange.
I see it.
And it's just a reminder to me of that I'm going to be undertaking principled negotiation, and it helps me to explain it to the other person if they're not going to.
Very nice, right? Yes, thank you. Well, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Awesome.